Morning sunlight spilled through the towering windows of Ravenshire Estate, pouring over polished marble floors and gilded walls that reflected wealth, power, and centuries of noble history. Outside, perfectly trimmed gardens stretched toward the horizon where fountains sparkled beneath the early summer sky. To everyone who saw it, Ravenshire looked like something from a dream. To Amelia Ashbourne, it felt strangely empty. Only 3 months earlier she had arrived at the estate as Lady Amelia Ashbourne, and by sunset she had become the Duchess of Ravenshire, the wife of Duke Alexander Ravenshire himself. Society had called it the marriage of the year. Young women had envied her. Older ladies whispered about her extraordinary luck. Men had admired the alliance between two powerful families. Amelia remembered the day clearly. She had stood inside St. Aldan Cathedral beneath golden candlelight, while white roses decorated every corner. The great bells had rung through the city as Alexander stood beside her in his black ceremonial coat. He had looked impossibly handsome, tall and composed, with dark hair neatly brushed back and serious gray eyes that seemed carved from stone itself. When he looked at her, he had not looked unhappy, but he had not looked happy either. Amelia had ignored the tiny ache inside her chest then. Love could grow, she had told herself. Not every marriage began with passion. Some marriages began with friendship, some with patience, and perhaps there simply needed time. She had believed that. She still wanted to believe it. A knock interrupted her thoughts. "Your Grace?" a maid said softly. Amelia turned from the window. "Yes." "The Duke requests breakfast in the East dining room." A tiny smile appeared on Amelia's face. "Thank you. Perhaps today would be different. Perhaps today Alexander would stay longer. Perhaps today they would actually talk." Hope had become a dangerous habit. The East dining room was enormous, far larger than necessary for 2 people. Long windows overlooked gardens filled with roses, while silver chandeliers hung overhead. Alexander was already seated when Amelia entered. He glanced upward briefly. "Good morning." His voice was calm and polite. Amelia smiled warmly. "Good morning." She sat beside him while servants moved silently around the room, placing tea and breakfast before them. For several moments, only the sounds of silver utensils touching porcelain could be heard. Amelia looked toward him carefully. "Will you be at the estate this afternoon?" Alexander continued reading papers beside his plate. "No." "Oh." He turned another page. "I have meetings in the city." "I see." Silence returned. Amelia stared down her tea. She had imagined asking him to walk with her through the gardens. The roses had finally begun blooming, and she had thought perhaps. No, perhaps not. Across the table Alexander suddenly spoke. "There is a charity dinner tomorrow evening." Amelia looked up immediately. "Tomorrow? You'll attend with me." A small light returned to her eyes. "Of course." He nodded once and returned to reading. That was all. A few minutes later he stood. "I'll return late." Then he left. Amelia watched the doorway long after it closed. The tea in her cup had gone cold. Days became weeks. Weeks began quietly disappearing into one another. Amelia learned Alexander's habits. He preferred his coffee without sugar. He disliked excessive perfume. He worked late into the evening. He read near the library fireplace when troubled. He rubbed his temple whenever meetings exhausted him. She learned everything about him. Alexander seemed to learn almost nothing about her. Still, Amelia tried. She organized estate matters when staff became overwhelmed. She visited tenant families in nearby villages. She helped servants solve disputes. She remembered birthdays. She ordered repairs to homes damaged during spring storms. Slowly, the people of Ravenshire began loving their Duchess. Servants smiled when she walked through halls. Children ran toward her in villages. Workers greeted her warmly. She gave kindness freely. Alexander barely noticed. The following evening arrived with music, dancing, and glittering chandeliers. The charity gathering was held inside one of London's grand halls where aristocrats filled every corner. Amelia stood beside Alexander wearing a beautiful silver gown embroidered with delicate flowers. People greeted them constantly. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire. What a wonderful couple. How lovely. Amelia smiled politely. Alexander spoke with politicians and noblemen. Soon she found herself standing slightly behind him, then beside him, then alone. Again, she tried not to let disappointment show. As she looked across the room, a soft feminine laugh caught her attention. Lady Celeste Whitmore stood beside Alexander. Celeste was beautiful and elegant with golden hair and effortless confidence. She laughed as Alexander actually smiled. Amelia stared. Not because she was jealous. Not exactly. But because that smile felt unfamiliar. Alexander rarely smiled around her. Celeste touched his arm lightly while speaking. Alexander answered. Another small smile. Amelia looked away. Something painful tightened in her chest. Nearby whispers floated through the crowd. Quiet. Careless. Cruel. I rarely see the Duke with his Duchess. Lady Celeste and the Duke seem rather close. They certainly look happier together. Amelia pretended not to hear. She smiled. She continued smiling. She had become very good at it. Hours later they returned to Ravenshire. Alexander sat across from her inside the carriage reading documents again. Moonlight moved across his face. Amelia wanted to ask him something. Anything. Instead, she remained silent, because she already feared the answer. Days passed, then more weeks. One afternoon, Amelia walked through the estate gardens while servants trimmed roses nearby. She slowed as voices reached her from around a stone wall. They had not realized she was near. The Duchess is too quiet. She's kind, very kind. Still, another voice whispered, sometimes I wonder if the Duke would even notice if she disappeared tomorrow. Laughter followed. Not cruel laughter. Thoughtless laughter. The kind that wounded most. Amelia stopped walking. For a moment the world seemed strangely still. The fountain water continued falling. Birds continued singing. The sky remained bright and beautiful. Yet something inside her quietly cracked. She forced a smile, then continued walking. That evening rain fell heavily over Ravenshire Estate. Wind struck windows while distant thunder rolled across dark skies. Amelia stood beside her bedroom window, staring into the storm. Behind her the room felt too large, too silent, too empty. She wrapped her arms around herself. Tears filled her eyes, though she did not allow them to fall. She thought of breakfast shared in silence. Long nights spent waiting. Unnoticed efforts. Forgotten hopes. Then very quietly, she whispered into the darkness. Perhaps they are right. Summer slowly surrendered to autumn, and the warmth surrounding Ravenshire Estate faded day by day. Leaves of gold and crimson drifted across stone pathways while cold winds moved through the gardens Amelia had once cared for so lovingly. The roses she had admired weeks earlier had begun losing their petals, and somehow she felt as though she understood them now. People often believed hearts broke suddenly. Amelia had learned differently. Hearts sometimes broke quietly, little by little, piece by piece, until one day there was almost nothing left. The days at Ravenshire continued, as they always had. Servants moved through hallways. Alexander attended meetings. Guests arrived. Letters came and went. Nothing had changed, except Amelia. At first no one noticed, not even Alexander. She still smiled, still greeted servants kindly, still fulfilled her duties as Duchess. But the brightness people once saw in her had begun disappearing. She no longer waited near windows for Alexander's carriage to return at night. She no longer asked whether his meetings had gone well. She no longer walked through gardens imagining future happiness. Instead, she became quieter, calmer, almost distant, and somehow that frightened no one because silence had become expected of her. One evening, Alexander entered the library after returning from the city. As usual, he removed his gloves and placed several documents onto the desk. He noticed Amelia sitting near the fireplace. A book rested in her lap. Normally, she would have stood immediately. Normally, she would have smiled. Normally, she would have asked about his day. But tonight, she simply looked up. You're back. Alexander loosened his coat. Yes. Silence followed. For a moment, he frowned slightly. Something felt unusual. What are you reading? He asked. Amelia looked down at the closed book. Oh, nothing important. Then she stood. I'll let you rest. She walked quietly toward the door. Alexander stared after her. Something about that conversation unsettled him. But after several seconds, he returned to his papers. The feeling disappeared. Days continued passing. Amelia had begun writing in a small journal. Late at night, she sat beside candlelight writing thoughts she had never spoken aloud. Things she could never say to Alexander. Things she feared saying even to herself. On one page she wrote, "I kept believing tomorrow would be different." On another, "I do not know when waiting began hurting." And finally, "I think I am becoming invisible even to myself." She closed the journal quickly after writing those words, because they frightened her. One afternoon, a letter arrived bearing the seal of distant relatives living in the countryside. Amelia opened it absent-mindedly. As she read, her eyes softened. The letter was simple, warm. It spoke of hills covered in wildflowers, peaceful mornings, village gatherings, and invitations to stay whenever she wished. "We would love your company. You have family here. Come if your heart ever needs rest." Amelia stared at those words for a long time. Rest. She had almost forgotten what that sounded like. Days later, Ravenshire prepared for another grand social gathering. Alexander had insisted they attend. By sunset, enormous chandeliers illuminated the ballroom, while music floated through the air. Noblemen and elegant ladies filled every corner. Laughter echoed beneath painted ceilings. Amelia wore a beautiful dark blue gown embroidered with silver details. Everyone complimented her appearance. Everyone smiled at her. Everyone except the one person whose attention mattered. Alexander spent most of the evening surrounded by politicians and acquaintances. Occasionally he looked toward Amelia, but only briefly, only enough to confirm she remained there. Across the ballroom, Lady Celeste approached Alexander again. Amelia watched from a distance. Celeste said something. Alexander laughed softly. Then they began dancing. Amelia lowered her eyes. Around her, couples moved gracefully across polished floors. Men held their wives carefully. Women smiled with affection. Some whispered quietly to one another. Some laughed. Some simply looked happy being together. Amelia suddenly realized something. She could not remember the last time Alexander had truly looked at her. Not looked through her. Not looked past her. Looked at her. A strange calm settled over her. Not sadness. Not anger. Something else. Something colder. Something quieter. Acceptance. For months, she had been begging silently for tiny pieces of affection. For attention. For warmth. For love. And now she felt tired. Very tired. Later that night, Alexander returned home long after midnight. He removed his coat and walked toward Amelia's room, expecting darkness and silence. Instead, he noticed candlelight beneath the door. He entered. Amelia? No answer. The room was empty. At first he thought little of it. Perhaps she was elsewhere. Then he noticed something resting upon the small table beside the window. A folded letter. And beside it, her wedding ring. Alexander stared. Slowly he picked up the letter. His eyes moved across familiar handwriting. "Alexander, I spent months believing that if I tried harder, smiled more, waited longer, perhaps one day you would see me. But I have realized something painful. You cannot lose something you never truly noticed. Please do not search for me. I do not hate you. I simply wish to find myself again." Amelia. Alexander stared at the page. For several moments he did not move. He read it again and again. His expression hardened. Confusion appeared first, then irritation, then disbelief. No, this made no sense. Amelia would not leave. She wouldn't. She had always been there, always waiting, always smiling, always. A sharp knock interrupted him. A servant stood outside, looking nervous. "Your Grace." Alexander turned slowly. "What is it?" "The Duchess," the servant said quietly. "She left before sunrise." Silence filled the room. Alexander looked around. For the first time, he truly saw it. The untouched piano near the corner. Pressed flowers inside books. Half-finished embroidery beside a chair. Small things. Things Amelia loved. Things he had never noticed before. And suddenly the room felt unbearably empty. For the first time in years, Alexander Ravenshire felt fear. Real fear. His eyes lowered toward the letter, still shaking slightly in his hands. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said. The morning after Amelia disappeared, Ravenshire Estate felt different. At first, Alexander could not explain it. Everything looked exactly the same. The chandeliers still hung from painted ceilings. Servants still walked through endless halls. The clock still ticked. Breakfast was still prepared every morning. Nothing had changed. Yet something felt terribly wrong. The silence. It felt heavier. Alexander sat in the east dining room, staring absently at untouched coffee. Across from him sat an empty chair. Amelia's chair. For months, perhaps years, he had barely noticed that chair. Now it seemed impossible not to. He looked toward the doorway, expecting her gentle smile, expecting her soft voice saying good morning, expecting her presence. But no one came. A servant entered carefully. "Your Grace, your breakfast." Alexander barely looked up. The servant hesitated. "The Duchess usually reminded us that you preferred extra cream on difficult mornings." Alexander frowned slightly. "Difficult mornings?" "Yes, Your Grace." The servant suddenly looked nervous. I apologize." He quickly left. Alexander stared after him. How had the servants known things about him that he himself had forgotten? The thought unsettled him. Days passed, then weeks. Alexander ordered people to search nearby villages. He sent letters, asked questions, visited towns. Nothing. No Amelia. At first he told himself he only wanted answers, only closure, only explanation. But every day, Ravenshire grew. Emptier. He walked through hallways and noticed strange things. Fresh flowers no longer appeared in the library. The household felt colder. Dinner felt silent. Even servants smiled less. One evening, Alexander entered his study and found Edmund Hale waiting. Edmund had been Alexander's closest friend since childhood. Unlike others, Edmund rarely feared speaking honestly. He watched Alexander quietly. "You look terrible." Alexander leaned against his desk. "I haven't slept." Edmund crossed his arms. "No." He studied him carefully. "You haven't forgiven yourself." Alexander looked away. For several moments, neither man spoke. Then Alexander said, quietly, "I don't understand." Edmund raised an eyebrow. "Don't understand what?" "Why she left." Edmund stared at him in disbelief. Then he laughed once. Not because something was funny, because he could not believe what he was hearing. "Alexander." His expression hardened. "You did not lose your Duchess the day she walked away." The room fell silent. Edmund continued. "You lost her piece by piece long before that." Alexander looked at him. "You ignored her loneliness. You ignored her efforts. You ignored her heart." Edmund sighed. "And now you're shocked that eventually she stopped waiting." Alexander had no answer, because for the first time, he knew Edmund was right. That night Alexander could not sleep. He walked into Amelia's room. Everything remained untouched. Moonlight spilled across floors. Slowly he opened drawers and shelves. Inside he found books she loved, sketches of gardens, pressed flowers, small notes. Then finally, her journal. Alexander hesitated, then opened it. He began reading. Alexander smiled today. I think he seemed less tired. "Perhaps tomorrow we will talk more." His chest tightened. He turned pages. I waited tonight again. Maybe he was busy. Maybe tomorrow. More pages. More waiting. More hope. Until finally, I think I'm disappearing. Alexander closed the journal. His hand shook. For the first time in years, tears burned his eyes. And for the first time, he cried. Months passed. Winter slowly gave way to spring. One morning, new information finally arrived. A servant rushed inside, holding a letter. Alexander stood immediately. "What is it?" "The Duchess has been seen." His heart stopped. "Where?" "A countryside village near Rosewood Valley." Hours later, Alexander rode through endless roads beneath gray skies. For the entire journey, fear sat heavily in his chest. What if she refused to see him? What if she hated him? What if he was already too late? By afternoon, he arrived. The village was beautiful. Small cottages stood beneath green hills while children ran laughing across fields. As Alexander walked farther into town, he stopped. Because he saw her. Amelia stood near a garden surrounded by children. Sunlight touched her hair. She was laughing. Laughing. Not politely. Not pretending. Genuinely. For a moment Alexander simply stared, because he realized something painful. He had never seen her look so happy. Amelia turned. Her smile faded in surprise. Their eyes met. Silence stretched between them. Months ago Alexander would have expected her to run toward him. Instead she stood still. Calm, confident, different. Slowly Alexander walked closer. I found you. Amelia looked at him quietly. I see that. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Alexander said softly, I was afraid. Amelia blinked. Afraid. She had never heard him say words like that before. He looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. You asked why I saw you only after you disappeared. His voice shook slightly. I don't know if there's an answer good enough. He stepped closer. I was selfish. I thought having you beside me meant you would always remain there. He lowered his eyes. And I was wrong. Then before the entire village. Before children and strangers and passing villagers. The powerful Duke Alexander Ravenshire slowly fell to one knee. Not from duty, not from pride, not because society demanded it, but because love finally had. His voice became barely a whisper. Amelia, I cannot change who I was. But if you allow me, he looked into her eyes. I will spend the rest of my life becoming someone worthy of you. Tears filled Amelia's eyes. Months ago, she would have forgiven him immediately. Months ago, she would have run into his arms. But months ago, she had still been invisible. Now she knew her worth. She stepped closer. Very gently, she touched his hand. I will not return because I miss being your Duchess. Alexander looked up slowly. I will only return if we begin again. She smiled softly through tears. Not as a Duke and Duchess, as Alexander and Amelia. A beautiful smile finally broke across his face. A real one. And this time, it was for her, because she had once disappeared from his life,